today's session for CxXchange Success Hour is how to build a customer ROI calculator. And this is something that Cinthia Silva and I are very excited to share with you. We were looking all over trying to see if there was something else we should compare it against, and lo and behold, there's not a lot out there. This is apparently something folks aren't doing that much, or else they'd be yammering about it some more. So we're hoping that if we bring this to you today, you're going to start to kick the tires on it. You're going to start to have some ideas about it. And, basically we'll see more out there. We want more ideas out here, more ideas to kick the tires on. So that's our hope for today. And that hopefully will bring something to you here. Cynthia, oh, I did not pin you here. I do need to pin you. Hi, Cynthia. And we'll go back to gallery. All right, Cynthia. Why don't you just share a little bit about yourself, so in case folks don't know you.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here as always. Love this community. I'm massively involved in it, especially really this one. But my background, I spent most of my career, in sales on the client side, that side, pre-sale motion. And I made my pivot to post-sale with my role at Nasdaq, helping them launch a CSM team as well for their Nasdaq trade surveillance solution. And really during that whole time, it's really when I dug into communities to kind of learn, exchange ideas, and really look for ways to kind of upskill myself and others, which is what I think this community does very, very well. So super happy to be working on or talking about this topic, because I think this is one of the things that can really help when you're looking at renewals, you're bolstering your relationships with existing customers, to show them the ROI. It's a little tricky because we know value and ROI is different for each customer, but hopefully some of these frameworks will help.
Awesome. Okay. So why don't we sort of dig in, and as usual, we will share with you kind of what we came up with. And as usual, we're always interested in questions or insights or comments, or if you've built something and we didn't see it, then feel free to share. So a couple of things we were thinking about, and one is when you're putting together an ROI framework for that customer value, because it has so much, if your customer is receiving value is the clearest indicator, right? If they're going to renew or expand with you. And so and that's very important these days when everyone is closely evaluating if they're going to keep your product or, try to consolidate products, things like that. So the first thing we thought about then really is a solution value score, right? So it's not just the ROI calculator and if they've achieved value, but first just measuring how central is your product to their business. Because your productivity tool might be one of the best things since sliced bread, but if it isn't really that central to their business, they may still decide to, do without you, even if they've gotten a lot of value, right? And so they may still put you on the chopping block. So the first thing we thought about was for the solution value score, value awareness, to measure then for the executive buyer and stakeholders, for your champion or the admin, your super users versus your end users, really thinking about them in these different buckets, because they may have different perspectives based upon if they're using your product every day, if they're using it in a different way, if they're having to be like the admin on your product, or maybe they're not using your product at all, or they may be using it sometimes infrequently, but they just may not be as engaged, and yet they're the decision maker, right? So thinking about these things, then how would they think about your product? How central is it? And then also, how would they calculate that ROI? So those are the sort of two parts of it. The other thing is the reason why we think it's so important to somehow ascribe some sort of value or number and also dollar amount where possible, is to ensure that there's just some sort of like, if you have a number attached to it, then you can measure it and then you can evaluate it. If it's when it's squishier, when you're just speaking to, if something is, oh, I don't know, I think they get value, then, where do you really put that? If you had to put a number to it, there's something sort of more black and white when you have to actually assign a number to it. Yeah, Pam? Oh, you're on mute.
So, I'm working on a customer education ROI calculator. It's a real calculator.
Oh, that's right, but I haven't had a chance to see it yet.
No, it's fine. But one of the things I'm doing is I'm getting feedback, and somebody said to me, ROI is actually a real term. So it's an investment term. And so we need to really be aware of, are people thinking, oh, it's, the number, it's a percentage. Just, we need to keep in mind what ROI means to people.
Yeah, very true, right? Because, they're putting in money, they're paying for the product, and, then they may not, a little bit. So when you do an investment, when you think about when you're investing your own money, right, you also don't just want your money back, right? There should be some sort of value beyond, like, I gave the bank my $5 and then 20 years later, I got $5 back. I feel kind of gypped. Why is that? Well, because they held on to my $5 for all that time. I want something more than $5, right? So when you think about an investment and a return on investment, you want a bit more than just the money that you put in. So if you're only saving as much time as the money it cost you to, that you would have spent anyway, you feel kind of gypped, right? You want more. All right. So first, going then on what we were referring to as the SVS, the solution value score. How central is your solution to your customer's business, and really putting it, like, you can make it a 1 to 10, but we thought it would be kind of easier to just make it a 1 to 5. Makes it very clear. How big is the problem your solution solves for them? Putting that on a 1 to 5. And how big of a priority is the problem that your solution solves? And the key thing on this is, you can go ahead and put in your own opinion of it, but it's also sort of a so what. If you don't get this feedback from your customers, then, sort of like, if the tree falls in the forest and no one heard it, sort of thing, did it really fall? Right, same sort of idea.
Yeah,
Cynthia,
Jan,
what did you want to say to that?
Yeah, it's a good point, Jan. I mean, I think also to this going back to the previous page when we're looking at the different stakeholders, this is like how classic multi-threading, right? Where like if you were going to contact different levels, an executive buyer versus a user versus a champion, et cetera. You're not going to approach them in the same ways. Things that are important to them are different. And that's where these 3 questions come into play. You have to look at that. How central is the solution to your solution? Is your solution to their business? You have to look at it from all 3 perspectives. And then the alignment, as always, is absolutely critical, because what people consider valuable and actual make that investment in your solution different. And we really need to adjust that and make sure you've got that aligned as well.
Well, exactly that. And so that's why when you think about how, when we talk about surveying around this, that you want to track the persona and the score. Right. And then, if you're going to do it as well, compare your score against the customers. Right. So is your perception off base? Right. That's helpful to understand. But also, if you think back on these personas, right, I'll go back to these different groups. Let's say your end users are giving you a really great score. Maybe they're saying that, this is all 5s, but the decision makers are giving you 1s or 3s even, right? Then you want to take a look at it. Maybe what you can do is go to the decision maker and say, hey, all of the folks in your company, like 90% of them are giving us 5s, just so that you understand this, right? And see if there is even a disparity between the different types of stakeholder groups as well. David, you're on mute though.
I did not mean to raise my hand, Jen. Sorry.
Oh, okay, that's fine. But if you have a comment, feel free. Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
of course.
Yeah. So this is like the first step that we're suggesting is to first identify how central it is. Now you may have some information about your, like how critical the product is to, like, and the types of solutions they're looking for and that sort of thing. But so that you've been able to gain either through the sales process or as you've been working with your client, but it's something that you should, I think you want to be sure that you're still getting updates, because things change, right? And since things change, you don't want to assume that whatever it was during the sales process, that it's still true today. Now we're getting to building the ROI calculator and the key components for building the ROI calculator. Now, and we'll have an example of this, but we want to sort of walk through kind of 3 general areas. First, you want to identify then, as I was just mentioning, the goals and the pain points. What did they buy? What information do you have about the sales process? And how might you update it? I was just referring to here, your current customer goals and stakeholders. Now, part of that could be that what's changed in their business. Also, part of it is as they're going through a customer life cycle with you, and there are changes over time in terms of the value that they're receiving from your product. And maybe they're with you for 2 or 3 years. Their goals in terms of how they're using your product, should probably change over time as well. Then you want to basically transform that into outcomes, right? And understand how do they, what sort of outcomes does the customer want in order to perceive value? And what activities do they need to do in order to achieve value, right? As you go through and you're documenting this, and again, we'll have an example, then you want to identify what it is that you're going to be measuring, because it's in these types of specifics that you can get to those specific numbers that can give you those outputs. Then you're looking at a score, right? What activities has a customer done versus what do they need to achieve? So maybe they've done loads and loads of things, but they haven't actually gotten to that end point where they actually achieve the value. So you want to differentiate. Some things are smaller effort involved, and some things are bigger projects and bigger effort, right? So you still want to identify, because if it was a big, project for them to get to that point of achieving value, even if they've done lots and lots of things and you've celebrated it all along the way, if they haven't actually gotten to that point of achieving value, it's like the difference between time to first value versus actually adopting and using your product and achieving value, right? You might still want to measure and celebrate those first points, but that's not quite
Jen.
the same. Yeah.
Yeah, Jen, I think you encapsulated this so well. Kind of like the thought process that I think we should be thinking, especially CSMs who are looking to be more strategic. This is kind of like walking you through like how you should be having those conversations. And I think one of the crucial points in this is, you might do everything perfect on the onboarding. Oh God, wouldn't that be amazing, right? Because that makes our customers stickier. But are you continuing to have? And I always call it discovery questions, right? Along that whole process, because priorities do change. And if you're not constantly asking them to say, yeah, we get along great, we're having these conversations. If you're not kind of challenging like that and showing that you're hitting those points that you want along the way and getting to where they said they wanted to be, then you might get caught flat-footed on this. So it's crucial to kind of keep having those conversations to maintain.
Right. And then David, I'll go to you in 1 second, but I just want to get to the example. So then what you do then is you actually have then an example of what the actual, pain point was, what they're trying to achieve, the outcomes they're trying to achieve. And apparently now my numbers are off here, sorry. When I downloaded this, the numbers went askew. But let me just fix that for a second. And then what now okay, David, you go ahead and talk while I fix the slide. Oh, you're on mute though, David.
I went off mute. I just want to raise a question because when people say ROI calculator, they're almost certainly talking about transaction-based value, if you will, of it costs X and you saved Y. And what you're showing here is kind of a discovery of like the bigger picture, value realization.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think that gets to the question that was raised earlier. But I just get concerned because a lot of what you're showing here is the discovery process and all the normal sales GTM motions. And ROI calculator, and every time I've seen it, it always fits into, it's something where you're trying to convince the customer and trying to let them calculate it. That's something Pam and I have talked about in the past.
Mm-hmm.
They never believe vendors. Like you can put the most beautiful calculator in the world together and no one will believe it. So what you have to do is you have to teach the customer how to use your formulas to do the math themselves and put their special secret numbers in of how much it costs to do this function today, which they will never want to tell you because it always gets used against them in the sales process. So it's like this whole game of offense and defense as part of sales of, well, how much does it cost you to FedEx something, which is actually a number you can get very easily. But nobody wants to tell you because if they tell you, they feel it's going to be held against them next time the negotiations come in. And so what you do is you give them a calculator and let them do the math. And then as a result, they believe it internally. And then that pulls you in deeper, in my experience.
Yeah, I get what you're saying about that, but I guess in part, I go back to Loom all the time about they keep telling me how many meetings I've saved because I'm using their video product. And the truth of the matter is I haven't saved any meetings. I'm not using it that way, right? So they're making assumptions about what sort of value I wanted to achieve. And that's why for me, when I was working on this with Cynthia, I went back to, well, how does the customer want to achieve value? What sort of impact were they expecting when they were purchasing the product? And yeah, I do have some examples here where you talk about dollars, and wherever you can ascribe dollars, that's helpful. But otherwise, like just where, if you're going to put it on a scale of 1 to 5, even, because also, getting back to what Pam's talking about in terms of the, if you put $5 in, do you want $5 out? No, I want more than $5 out, or else
10x.
Yeah.
Any enterprise will refuse to talk to you unless you're getting a 10x benefit.
Okay, so 10x, but whatever it may be, whatever they may ascribe and say they want 10x from it, in which case then they only get a 5 if they've gotten 10x on something. But the other reason too is we kind of put through an example here is because you can have a lot of different types of products and projects. And I think it's really important that we don't just give you like, here's this calculator, go and calculate now, that sort of thing. Like we didn't put it in a Google Sheet because we really wanted it to be something where you ask the questions of what is valuable to your customers, and really you're doing surveys and getting feedback and saying, in the same way that Bob London talks about asking your client, look, if you had to renew today, would you? Right. And they have to like all of a sudden say yes or no kind of thing. And it gets them to, give you that feeler. Really like get them to say, where would you put us? Would you put us, at a 3? I'm going to get worried now. Right. Like I need to know where I'm at because we haven't hit that renewal yet. We're not talking to you about that expansion yet, but I want to get there. Right. Anyway,
Yeah, actually,
go ahead, Cynthia. Sorry.
No worries. It's a good point. And actually, Dave, you bring up a really good point because I think the term ROI, right? Like there, some people will be really fixated on that, but I think what we're obviously using that like in, to kind of, you know, shine the light more on value realization. But what we know just on our own experiences and other peers too, most people aren't measuring this at all. They're not using any analytics for the most part. And you're right, people should be suspicious. Our customers should be, if they're like, oh, here's a calculator, go use this tool, because you're right, it's probably going to be something that it's going to benefit us. But this sort of, that's why we kind of broke it down this way, because we're like, this is something we're jointly looking at. Like we think it's this, you think it's that. Where's the shortcomings? Where are we missing? And I think it kind of can at least help quantify, or maybe in most cases, and I'm going on a limb on that one, but I feel confident with it. There's no quantifying happening at all. So at least that starts that process. But it's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I still, my opinion is they're not just looking at the dollars, they're looking at how they feel about something. And if you get them to ascribe a number to what they were expecting, what they wanted to achieve, and how they feel about that, and give a number, like you get a better sense of the perception of value that needs to be moved and changed with them. Hey, Ash.
Hey, yeah, I think like, just like coming from a sales perspective, like it's always super helpful to like even like when we looked at like ROI, it's not just like the investment value, but when you like scope out and try to understand, wait, like what problem are you trying to solve, and really like break down and try and quantify that. And it might mean like, hey, we or like the time that it takes for us to respond to customer support requests, it's like it takes too long. We have a team of 5 people, and like really they could be doing other things. We ideally want just like 2 people. How do we automate? And so you could actually relate the time that it takes to reduce, like if you're reducing that timeline and then you manage to actually get 2 people who are doing it instead of 5 people, you could actually quantify it by saying you're saving like the salary of those people, of 3 people, including the productivity, because they're going somewhere else. So it really just depends on what the solution is, what problem they are trying to solve for, and really kind of figuring out how can we quantify it. Because also I think this is really important, because if there is no way to quantify any of this, sometimes people just kind of go on a gut feeling of giving a random 1 to 5 number, but it might not even have like a valid base, because we've never given them the context as to like, how do you quantify the value?
Right. Well, there's that, but then, so when you think about all the different ways, so it's not just saving, how much time and how many resources it takes to do a certain thing, but also when they keep getting delayed on then meeting your customers' needs, and kind of like that domino impact. And then what sort of CSAT scores are they getting, and how did that impact, their churn and all of those things as well, right? So looking at all of the domino effect, but again, I still do think that there needs to be a way to quantify that perception, because in the end, you can be delivering all of that value. If they do not perceive that value to be important to their business or as critical to their business as something else, then you're out the door. You're not their first choice. But yeah, no, absolutely. All of, quantify and then think about what the other domino effects are. Hey, Adil.
Hey, Jan. This is a great conversation. I think I love what I'm hearing just about like the quantification needs to be both like believable, and then we need there to be buy-in, right? So I think they're like potentially 2 sides of the same coin, maybe different depending on who you're presenting to. So just something I think about a little bit differently, and I'll caveat this is maybe in a little bit more enterprise motion.
Great.
That like the ROI perspective might also be very personal to the person that is making the buying decision at the end of the day. And I think like our sales counterparts are very good at being like, who are the people across this account that are going to be involved, and like, what do they need to see and understand? And so like, sure, there's like maybe like a in an ideal world, this like nice, like beautiful number that can be packaged up and quantified that we need to do. But I'll just ask the customer, like, how do you make renewal decisions across all your other software tools? So, and like who's involved? And I'm involved in a deal right now where if the increase in price is more than 10%, then the CFO is involved. If it's less than 10%, then they're not. And and my champion told me my CFO calculates ROI differently than my CRO. Okay, so like, like we have information around how we go into that renewal, and now the ROI calculation and who we're getting buy-in from, so it's believable, looks extremely different depending on who we're actually working with.
I love that. I love that. Exactly. Because then you're thinking about your stakeholders, right? And that's why then it, for me, it doesn't make sense that Loom says I'm saving money, saving time on meetings, right? Ask them, how do they ascribe that value and then put that into your calculator? But find a way to get a number to it. Because if you have a number and they have to tell you in black and white, otherwise they might just say, yeah, no, things are great. Are they? Yeah. No, love that. That's a great example. Hey, Parth.
Hey. So I always thought the dollar amount that you were saving was the biggest deal. And then when I was at Airtable, we had a CFO panel, and the CFOs pretty much in unison were like, we don't actually care about that dollar saving because we think it's all BS. If they took all of the dollar savings at face value from all the different vendors, it just, the numbers don't add up.
Yep.
So one of the things
like
that
David was speaking to in terms of believability, right?
Yeah, it's believability, but there's just a bias almost that we don't believe anything that a vendor gives us almost. But one of the ways that they were kind of talking about overcoming that is like really focusing in, and I like that it's not all dollars on this one. It's like, talk about other metrics, right? Like, what was the time to value? What other things were we able to accomplish? Okay, you're saying you saved all this time. What was that team able to accomplish with that time savings? So I know there's people that are talking about just the dollar amount, and I like that you kind of have some of these other variables in there as well.
Yeah. I think it's important to, think about what is it that you're trying, because like for a wiki knowledge base for employees, right? Like that's one of those projects that could definitely go by the wayside unless you think about how integral it is and how important it is that everyone needs it, right? And so how do you quantify that? How do you identify that? It's one of those things that, that's why I thought like it was such a great example that Cynthia came up with for this. Hey, Amy, I know you had some thoughts in the chat too.
Yeah, thanks for just giving me a sec. I think one of the important things too is don't try to boil the ocean. What do you know what your product can do? Can you define it in 3 or 4 potential outcomes?
Yep.
Can you work with your customer to pick the one that's most important to them? Exactly.
Yep.
Then can you put all in on achieving that one, knowing that you will likely have spillover effect to achieve the others, but really guide them to the one that is most important to them. And then at the end of it, you're like, bonus, look what else you were able to achieve.
Right. Yeah. And that gets into setting expectations and things like that too. But yeah, it's like not only having sort of the outcomes that they're looking for, what is the, how do you put numbers to it or amount of dollars to it, as applicable, but then what are the things that show that you've actually either made progress or achieved, and where you're on track with that.
Do they agree that they're willing to work with you to achieve that? Because if they're willing to achieve that and they're willing to put the energy in also to collaborate with you, you're all more likely to achieve that. But when you have that first outcome piece and you know what you're after, it helps manage the change.
Yep. I know we want to get to breakouts, but let's just Cynthia and then David, and we'll go to breakouts. Yep.
Yeah, really quick, on Parth's point, I think you bring up a really good point, Parth, because I think the leaders, I mean, obviously if they can get an ROI and you can quantify that in dollars, that's amazing. But I agree, this is a bit to be suspicious. But what they really care about is, did your tool do what did it solve the problem we wanted it to solve? How effective is it? Are people able to implement groups. That's a big deal, especially that implementation. If it's not part of their workflows and they haven't abandoned their spreadsheets, then your tool is useless because now they're losing time because they're doing both. So I agree. It's not one or the other. It's all those things. And this is just another way to kind of quantify the success of it.
Yep. All right, David, take us out to our breakout sessions here. What's your final comment here before we go to breakout sessions, then come back as a group? You're on mute.
I'm trying to be polite and then I forget to unmute. So first, this is something which just as background, and Cynthia and Pam and then a couple of us have talked about this already. I've talked about with them. I used to teach a full day class, which this was 90% of the class, of how to talk about value, how to talk about, creating the perception of value. And you used a word that I use all the time, celebrate, because it's not about delivering the value. That's like, 75% of the problem. You actually have to make sure that they acknowledge, and I think someone else said, acknowledge the delivery of it. And then you have to make sure that they've communicated internally to their stakeholders that you're not allowed to talk to them, but internally you need to make sure that the value being delivered and the measurements, but not just measurements, but anecdotes about the success of that has to be communicated to the people who actually make the decisions. Because otherwise what was important last year might not be important next year, regardless of how much you deliver.
Right. Yeah. And so the fact that this changes, but that's why we talk about doing a survey, getting that information from the different stakeholder groups. If it turns out that the decision makers don't feel the same way as all the end users or something like that, you can say, hey, your end users gave us all 5s across the board, thought you'd want to know this, right? And then they can say, yeah, but our business is going in another direction. Then it's like, okay, you trumped me. But anyway, so here we have the breakout questions. I'm going to set out the breakout rooms. Be sure that you get just over in the chat, we have the resources, the slides, and the breakout notes. Let me set up. Why is it always a new way to do the breakout? Okay, I'm going to make it smaller groups because we're just going to go away for 15 minutes. I feel like I've failed you here. Okay, so I'm going to create 11 groups, like somewhere between 4 and 5 people in each group, I think. Okay, off you go. We'll be back in 15 minutes. I was reading in the chat there's some fantastic comments and even resources and blog posts that people have written in the chat. And I just want to say, I hope that we'll continue this conversation, whether it's in our community or if you're doing LinkedIn posts, tag CxXchange, tag us, tag each other, so that we can continue this conversation. Some of the takeaways I have is that we need to get agreement with our clients, what that value is and how to measure it, right? That's part of what I got. What are some other takeaways that people discussed in the groups? Ash?
So David in our group was actually sharing some really interesting stuff. Maybe like David, you can talk about it, but the one thing that I really liked was the FTE. So like when you're trying to quantify, a lot of the times people won't actually share like how much people's salaries are or whatever, right? So
sure.
Something called FTE. I never knew about it, but David, maybe you can talk about that. But that was like a big takeaway for me.
So
right. So depending upon what needs to be evaluated, right, and how they're gauging it, David?
Yeah.
Well, I shared a slide from the class I was talking about, and basically one of the measurements, full-time equivalent, is what FTE stands for. And if you've ever done budgeting exercises, the number, like instead of saying like Tom's salary is X and Sally's salary is Y, for a role, they just have what they call full-time equivalent cost. And it's kind of the average budgeting number that they use. and they don't really care which job. They just kind of say an employee at this level costs this much. And for all budgeting exercises inside the company, then they go ahead and they wind up doing using that number for everything. And so when you're teaching your champion how to calculate the value of your function, the friction of something, if something takes 10 minutes now or 15 minutes now and it can take 1 minute later, you use the FTE cost, and the formula shows you how to kind of break down the how much is 15 minutes worth versus 10 minutes or 1 minute. But the thing is that many people don't know about it. And so you have to teach your champion to learn inside the company, go ask, what is the FTE cost of what I should be trying to figure out here? And they don't want to share it with you, the vendor, but internally it's a number that's well known.
Sure. Well, yeah. So that's one option if that's an important number for how you're valuing your product. Keith will be going out right now because we're at time.
Perfect. One of the things that really jumps out is we have CSTAT, we have NPS, but now we have another surveyable set of data points that we can look from start to finish, how that's being impacted. And this slight modification will work exceptionally well both in an EBR slide situation, and will also work exceptionally well if you're meeting internally to talk about renewal planning and renewal likelihood as well. In some ways, this might be even more effective than CSTAT because you can, especially if you analyze it across the personas.
Right. Yeah. And things like CSAT can be useful insights, but in the end, if you're looking at, are they going to renew? This is where you're actually asking them, how do you evaluate it? Where do we rank? And, where do things stand? And you can actually put a number to it. So yeah, love that, Keith. So great. Well, look, I want to hear more from you. I can't today, unfortunately, but let's continue this conversation. We have a whole place where we started this conversation over in Slack. We can continue it there. If you're posting about it, share it with each other, share it in our community so we know you're posting about it. Let's continue the conversation. Let's get a plethora of different examples out there. We don't want to just have this one example of a wiki, of an internal wiki, right? Let's have several. Okay. Thanks you everybody. So much.
Great conversation.
Great conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Right.
Have a great day.
See you next Tuesday.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Success Hour, formerly known as CS Office Hours. We regularly put out new content, so to be the first to know, like this episode, tap that notification bell, hit that subscribe button, and we look forward to seeing you soon.